Extremely passionate about nutrition, Jon Clinthorne earned his PhD in human nutrition from Michigan State University for his research involving diet and immune function. He has been involved in a variety of research topics, including aging, probiotics, caloric intake, immune function, and omega-3 fatty acids. Dr. Clinthorne's current focus is using his understanding of nutritional science to dispel nutritional myths and help people take responsibility for their own well-being by educating them about the numerous ways that diet supports health and that they need not to be afraid of food. When not working as a nutrition education specialist at Natural Grocers, you can find Dr. Clinthorne's running, hiking, or skiing in the mountains of Colorado. Today, Dr. Clinthorne's will be sharing with us the role nutrition plays in good brain health. Dr. Jon Clinthorne.
Thank you. Wow, we have had some fantastic presentations today, haven't we? So I'm going to change things up a little bit and start to talk about diet and environment and the role that these things play in brain health, brain function. I have a little disclaimer. I originally wanted to title my presentation the Microbiota-Gut-Brain Axis, Visceral Hypersensitivity, and the Low FODMAP Diet. I decided that was probably a little too long, so instead I shortened it to the gut-brain axis and visceral hypersensitivity. And I saw that the title of today's symposium was Wired Together. I thought that was such a great theme for my talk. Today I'm going to talk a lot about our brain, but not the brain that you think I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what we call our second brain. And by that I mean our enteric nervous system. If my pointer, I have to turn it on first. There you go. I'm going to talk about our enteric nervous system, also known as our second brain. And this is our gastrointestinal tract. The gastrointestinal tract is home to a mesh-like network of 500 million neurons. That's 5 times the number found in the spinal cord. It produces 90% of our body's total serotonin, 50% of our body's total dopamine, and it's capable of regulating itself autonomously. That means it can work independent of our central nervous system. It also is able to communicate with our central nervous system via the vagus nerve, where it's in bidirectional communication with our brain. And you really can't talk about our second brain, our enteric nervous system right now, without talking about the bacteria that live in it. And I have some news for you guys. Me, you, all of us, we are more bacterial than we are human. Bacterial cells outnumber human cells 10 to 1. You have 100 trillion bacteria living in you, on you, all over you. And these cells are capable of doing amazing things for our health. I want to take this kind of as a time to talk a little segue about when I had the opportunity to meet one of my heroes in research, a guy by the name of Rob Knight. He's like the Michael Jordan of gut microbiome research. And he was telling us this fascinating story about how they followed the gut microbiome of people and were able to map out their behaviors by looking at how people's microbiomes were being exerted on their environments. And so what they did was they looked for all sorts of different bacteria in a public restroom. And they were looking for fecal bacteria. And they're like, where are these fecal bacteria going to be? They expected to see them on the toilet handles. Nope, they found dirt on the toilet handles, bacteria that lived in the soil. It turns out people are flushing the toilets with their feet. They also learned you should keep your toothbrush 7 feet away from your toilet, if you know what I mean. Dr. Knight also explained to us that you can map out other aspects of human behavior by looking at the microbiota, and also talked about how some really interesting research coming out of Jeff Gordon's lab was showing that in germ-free mice, these are mice without any microbiota, they display different behaviors. And it was just the beginning of this when we started to understand how our microbiota is capable of influencing our behaviors. What's really interesting when we talk about the microbiota is that yeah, it's incredible that you're outnumbered 10 to 1 by the bacterial cells living on you. But even more incredible is the fact that the bacteria living in your gut possess 100 times more genetic material than the entire human genome. Let that sink in for a second. You really are not just human. You are a meta-organism. You are this huge symbiotic organism where your behaviors, which you once thought you were controlling, might not be so controlled by you. They might be being controlled by microbes. I like to call this microbial mind control. This is the aspect that microbes are actually maybe controlling our behavior. People are laughing, right? That's scary, it's kind of crazy, but it shouldn't be that crazy to think about. We all know rabies, which is a microbial infection, can be very well controlling of our brain function. There's lots of other examples of microbes that can control behavior out in the literature. So that brings me to the microbiome gut-brain axis. You really can't call it the gut-brain axis anymore without talking about what the microbiota are doing. Why are we letting 4.5 to 6.5 pounds of bacteria ride around in our gastrointestinal tract? Why are we feeding them? What are they doing for us? And this is a really powerful symbiotic relationship that we have evolved to develop with our microbiota. So we now know that the gut microbiota are capable of synthesizing vitamins. They make a lot of the B vitamins. They're really important for educating our immune system. As our immune system develops from infancy up into about 3 years old, the microbiota also changes. And these two things educate each other and help each other develop. Germ-free mice, these mice that don't have any microbiota, they don't have very well educated immune systems and are very susceptible to developing autoimmunity. They also nourish gut epithelial cells. They produce short-chain fatty acids that our gut cells can actually use for energy, and this is really important in keeping our gut healthy. And then a key in this is that they interact with our enteric and central nervous systems. They're capable of producing neurotransmitters and other metabolites that can influence the way that the enteric nervous system, this nervous system in our gut, is communicating with the central nervous system. And this bidirectional network is called the Microbiota-Gut-Brain Axis. Talking about these germ-free mice, this is the best model that we have for really studying the direct behavior that the microbiota-gut-brain axis can influence. And some really seminal studies, 10 years ago now, these studies were published, found that germ-free mice have increased anxiety behaviors, increased panic-like behaviors, and that if you were to give them microbiota from just free-living, regularly housed laboratory mice, then you could actually alleviate some of these anxiety behaviors in these germ-free mice. What was even more importantly discovered was that if you gave them E. coli, a kind of pathogenic, not very good bacteria, then it would completely reduce the beneficial effects of giving them regular bacteria. It didn't have any benefit of reducing anxiety. But if you gave them Bifidobacterium infantis, a very common probiotic bacteria, you could reduce those anxiety-like behaviors even more than regular bacteria could. So this kind of pointed to the fact that a single bacteria could influence behavior so powerfully. And that's kind of one of the things that we have to talk about when we're talking about the microbiota-gut-brain axis is how powerful these bacteria are in influencing our behaviors. Now, alterations to the gut microbiota, this is called dysbiosis, often occur comorbidly with gastrointestinal and psychiatric symptoms, but other sorts of things too, such as autoimmune disease, metabolic disease, even relationships with cardiovascular disease and bone health have been shown to occur with dysbiosis. So this term dysbiosis is kind of vague. It's because we don't really know what it's supposed to look like, what the microbiota is supposed to look like. What we know is that it's an ecosystem and that diversity in any ecosystem is good. But if you lose diversity, you seem to lose that beneficial effects. So dysbiosis is very commonly seen in autism. And the hallmark of autism dysbiosis is this complete loss of diversity. You see that instead of 1,000 or 1,500 species, all of a sudden these people only have 400 species of bacteria living in their GI. The majority of the bacteria live in the colon, with smaller amounts living in the small intestine. And really, again, it just comes down to having a very diverse microbiota. People always want to ask me, well, what is a good microbiota? We don't know. All we know is that diversity is key of any ecosystem. And how do you develop dysbiosis? You really don't need to look any further than kind of the common American life, right? There's so many things in our life that are so bad for our gastrointestinal system. So antibiotic overprescription, overuse, the CDC estimates that 1/3 of antibiotic prescriptions are wrongly prescribed. We have a huge problem with overuse of antibiotics. I know when I was in college, if my roommates had a cold, he'd be like, oh, I'm gonna go get some antibiotics from and that's a viral infection. You don't need antibiotics for that. We have huge problem with the overprescription of antibiotics. And obviously antibiotics are broad spectrum and can alter our microbiota. I was so happy to hear about the talk about exercise because we're finding that sedentary behaviors, such as a lot of sitting, a lot of TV watching, can even result in changes to the microbiota. So physical activity is really important because you give your microbiota feedback for it to change. Obviously, what you eat is going to be really important in determining your microbiota. Whether you're eating fermented foods and kind of inoculating your gut with healthy microbes is critical for helping develop a healthy microbiota. And then hygiene. We live in this very hygienic environment these days. The hygiene hypothesis was put forward 50 years ago when it was first noticed that people living on farms had much lower incidence of allergies than people living in urban areas. And that was the initiation of the idea that we live too hygienic. We don't get out in the soil and play anymore. We wash our food so much. We're no longer giving our bodies that diverse microbiota that they need. And when we have dysbiosis, what happens? Well, studies from Jeff Gordon's lab showed that if you were to take a dysbiotic mouse who you fed too much fat, and now that mouse has become obese, and you were to take just the bacteria from that mouse's gut and transfer it to a lean mouse, you could make that lean mouse obese. So we're starting to see that it can really influence health. Another obvious aspect of health that it can influence is the health of our gut. And so once you have that altered microbiota, we run into a lot of chronic low-grade intestinal inflammation. And that chronic low-grade intestinal inflammation can really lead to something called visceral hypersensitivity and irritable bowel syndrome. Now, irritable bowel syndrome presents often as either diarrhea predominant or constipation predominant. And almost always is associated with visceral hypersensitivity. And the reason I'm talking about irritable bowel syndrome at a brain health symposium is that when this hypersensitivity occurs, we see that there's a lot of communication to the brain via the gut-brain axis, and this can result in pain, discomfort, anxiety, and other adverse reactions. A lot of people are suffering from irritable bowel syndrome. 20 to 30% of the population has diagnosed irritable bowel syndrome. Who knows how many people have undiagnosed food sensitivities and irritable bowel syndrome? And what's really interesting is that a lot of this can be communicated via the gut-brain axis, where you obviously have some gastrointestinal manifestations with irritable bowel syndrome that all lead to decreased quality of life, but you also have these extra gastrointestinal manifestations that can lead to decreased quality of life. And what do I mean by extra gastrointestinal manifestations? I mean these comorbidities such as panic disorders. 20 people with IBS have panic disorder. 20% of people with IBS have panic disorders. 30% of people with IBS have generalized anxiety disorder. Almost 50% of people with IBS have major depressive disorder. You can find some numbers for strong correlations with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and alcohol and drug abuse with IBS as well. So this is definitely something that is not just impacting the health of the gut, but it's also impacting the health of the brain and ultimately the quality of life, because that's what we're all about, right? When we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, ADD, dyslexia, these things are all things that eventually affect quality of life, and we all want to have the absolute highest quality of life that we can. So what can we do, right? I'm here to give you guys some solutions. There are some really interesting nutritional approaches that I want to share with everyone. And really they're about alleviating the internal stressors and trying to fix that microbial imbalance. The very first thing that we have is a probiotic-based intervention. There was a very nice meta-analysis of all the probiotic interventions that have ever been done in IBS, and let me tell you, there are a lot. This field of microbiota research is just exploding right now. And reviewing thousands and thousands of studies, the authors concluded that probably the best interventions use a single organism. They use lower dosages of organisms than you would see with a lot of other interventions. And they use often Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a probiotic yeast, or Bacillus coagulans. This is a spore-forming soil bacteria, a bacteria normally found in the soil, not something that we have in our diets very much anymore. Or some of the more common probiotics such as Lactobacillus plantarum or Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG. And I think the probiotic stuff is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But what I think is even more interesting is something called the low FODMAP diet. And I just want to share this quote about the low FODMAP diet with everyone. And it is, unlike most dietary manipulations tried in the past to alleviate gastrointestinal symptoms of IBS, all studies on low FODMAP diets have consistently shown symptomatic benefits in the majority of patients with IBS. That is really powerful. In the field of nutrition, we don't often get to say that something has unanimously affected any sort of disease outcome. Nutrition is just usually just one factor. Sometimes our hands are tied in nutrition because we can only do a little bit. But this diet is so powerful. I remember when I found out about this diet in, I think, 2011, 2012, it was only being used in New Zealand and Australia, and it's slowly spreading across the world right now and being used for more therapies in IBS, being put into more clinical trials. I do have to admit, the first time I heard about it, I was like, low frog mats? Low fog hats? What in the world is this? So let me take a second to explain actually what FODMAPs are. These are fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. That may seem very abstract still, but I bet a lot of you are very familiar with a very common FODMAP intolerance that leads to GI distress and some psychological issues too, is lactose intolerance. Lactose is a disaccharide that if you can't digest, it makes its way into our large intestine, where these FODMAPs can then be fermented. And if you have visceral hypersensitivity because of an altered GI microbiota, that fermentation presents itself as extremely painful and can trigger anxiety, can trigger depression, can trigger all sorts of behaviors. And then also if these FODMAPs aren't digested or absorbed, they can exert osmotic effects in the large intestine, which pulls a lot of water into our GI, and that can lead to diarrhea as well. So there's a lot of really interesting information out there about what different FODMAP intolerances people have. And there are really 5 categories of high FODMAP foods when we're looking at the high FODMAP foods. We have fructose, which is a monosaccharide that's a very commonly problematic FODMAP, and this can be foods like high fructose fruits, such as apples and pears. Honey is also about 50% fructose, and then obviously this big problematic is high fructose corn syrup. I just talked about how lactose intolerance in dairy foods can be a really big problem for a lot of people. And then we have our more complex carbohydrates, such as the fructans and galactans that are found in wheat, onion, garlic, lentils, legumes. And this kind of, beans, the magical fruit, right? This is what we're talking about. We're talking about the FODMAPs in beans. And then we have our polyols. Polyols is one of the less well understood types of FODMAPs. I guess if I really wanted to get the importance of watching out for polyols home to people, it's go on Amazon and read the reviews for the sugar-free Haribo gummy bears. They're horror stories from what these sugar alternatives do because they're not absorbed, they make their way into the GI tract and cause all sorts of problems for people, ultimately leading to a lot of psychological issues. And so if you want a really comprehensive list of different FODMAP-containing foods and their low FODMAP alternatives, this is a great link. Also, just type it into Google. It'll come up right away for you. And so what's the protocol if people are put onto these low FODMAP diets? And really, people seem to only have to follow a low FODMAP diet for about 4 to 8 weeks. And this is great because people who are dealing with IBS and the psychological symptoms associated with IBS previously had to go on full elimination diets for the rest of their life. It was essentially, hey, eat one meat, eat one fruit, and eat one type of bread and see if it bothers you. And then if that bread bothers you, swap it out for a different bread. And that was all they had. They had such limited variety in their diets. So by kind of categorizing and figuring out a diet that addresses all of these issues, they've really been able to decrease the amount of time that people have to spend on a low FODMAP diet. They watch IBS symptoms and look at quality of life in these patients. And some studies, they see significant improvements of mood, quality of life, and other symptoms associated with IBS in as much as 90% of participants. With a dietary intervention, that is huge. That is so powerful. I don't even think that the actual interventions using using pharmaceuticals are reaching these kind of degrees of efficacy. So it's very, very powerful. And then you can actually go back to the FODMAP-containing foods and start to reintroduce little categories, little pieces of those different foods and see if they're triggers. And by doing that, you're able to improve quality of life even more in these people because you're now not only eliminated and restricted on certain foods, you're really able to figure out which FODMAPs you have your sensitivity to. A lot of people, for example, they're only sensitive to fructose. They just don't absorb fructose very well. A lot of people don't absorb lactose very well, and they can eat the rest of the spectrum and not have to worry about it. But really, what it all comes down to is that we see decrease in the psychiatric symptoms associated with IBS. We see a significant improvement in the quality of life for people who are really suffering from all the sorts of other aspects or other consequences of IBS. And so, are there other applications of this diet? Not everybody has IBS, although I think a lot of people do have some sort of subclinical food intolerances. We're talking about food intolerances a lot and how those can influence behaviors. And so, no, not everyone has IBS, but there are other applications of this diet. There's been studies now that have looked at fructose malabsorption for people who don't even have symptoms of IBS. They just don't absorb fructose very well. And those people have frequent bouts of depression. By removing fructose from their diet, they're significantly improving their bouts of depression. Again, I talked about lactose intolerance, the sorbitol intolerance. This is an artificial sugar that's commonly used for a lot of those sugar-free treats that people eat. This is a really powerful polyol that can really cause some significant gastrointestinal issues. And then, here's the big guy is the non-celiac gluten sensitivity, right? Everybody who's trying to eat gluten-free and they're avoiding wheat. Well, it turns out a lot of studies are now showing that it's not necessarily the gliadin proteins in that gluten, in that wheat that's affecting people, but it's actually the FODMAPs in the wheat that seem to be affecting people. So for people who are dealing with non-celiac gluten sensitivity and any of these issues associated with when they consume wheat, and they have all these sorts of, people often say, oh, I can't concentrate if I've eaten wheat. I can't sleep. I have depression when I eat wheat. A lot of this is actually thought to be related to now their FODMAP content of the food that they're consuming. A researcher did a little trick on his subjects. He told them that he was giving them a gluten-free muffin, but instead it was a FODMAP-free muffin, and he challenged them later with something that had FODMAPs in it and saw that it really was the FODMAPs and not the gluten that was being so offensive to those people. So really, I hope that this presentation has kind of opened people's eyes to a totally new dietary paradigm that is worth considering anytime that you're talking about someone's mental health, is also the health of their gastrointestinal tract and how these two things work together. And simply by carefully eliminating some foods and replacing them with others, you can have a significant improvement in their quality of life. So thank you.